operational. Let's get the clickety-clack going here. Bloop, 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 whoops. Rats. I hate it when I hit the wrong button here and something happens. Go back through the rigmarole of getting this set up. Not that I know what the hell I'm doing on the stupid laptop, because the buttons are all clumsy as far as human beings are concerned. There, I think we're okay. That's apparently on screen. Let's try again. On. Okay, got it running. The wonderful world of 20th century technology intruding on the 21st century. Welcome to Evolution Hour, Troubles in Paradise Project, tortucanwordpress.com. There's a reason why there's a website there. There's stuff there. Everybody fiddle with it. Okay, I can stop sharing that part, and we can close that little puppy down and get back to what we were doing. And Jackson is here with headphone problems apparently resolved, so we can deal with that. Yep. And I am seeing the chat. Hello, I'm seeing the chat. Yay! Now, last week, as we know, I wasn't getting that stupid chat in there. Ian's in the thing, Slade, Stephen Early. Yay! Okay, that's much nicer. We're actually functional again. As usual, we are going through page by page, source by source, replacing Darwin from Nathaniel Jeanson, who has pretensions of replacing Darwin. And, this is on to chapter 6, which has to do with how he's kind of trying to end run the time problem and end run the issue of how you can connect up artificial selection and natural selection. He, at one point, is drawing an authority quote from Richard Dawkins's The Greatest Show on Earth about the extent to which artificial selection can do stuff, at which point Jeanson tries to do his magic trick, which is, I'll be putting a full quote up on the link. I'm not arguing that hundreds of equid species formed in just 12,000 years or less. I'm arguing that this time scale produced just 7 equid species. If over 850 equid breeds can form in a few thousand years, then surely 7 species require no longer. Which, of course, speciation, yeah.
No.
Isolation and the changes in the dynamics of natural selection from artificial one, which relate to particular traits, not a population operating in a naturally sustaining dynamic.
To quote a different book, a different popular book on evolution, one by Jerry Coyne, speciation events generally take between 500,000 and 5 million years. So
yeah. Well, the fun part is the source he puts up for it. So he cites one and only one technical paper for the issue of the origin of breeds, which happens to be this cute little paper from Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And don't worry, I'll be putting a link up in the thing because it's open access. Current Perspectives of the Future of Domestication Studies, which I didn't even list as a technical paper. I treated it as a commentary piece because it's a review of stuff. But anyway, it's really a nice paper that was already in my bibliography before Jeanson decided to fiddle with it. Really nice little chart in there showing the time frames on various domestications zones and how much they suspect is or is not reflected in the data that we have. And then a really detailed breakdown of the various plants and animals that were domesticated and the time frame that was taking place over this period. That's where the 12,000 years comes in. It is about the pacing of domestication of lentils, peas, rice, pigs, goats, sheep, silkworms, melons, hyacinth beans, squash, cocoa, alpacas, guinea pigs in various places around the world. Not once is it asserting that any of the core species that are being bred originated in just the last 12,000 years, let alone the last 6,000 years. let alone the last 4,500 years, which is the secret little plan that he's got to present later on in the book when we get past chapter 6. So he just simply conclusion jumps with this chart. Let's see if I can put this up here for you to all see. Oh, you'll be so impressed. Not with this cute little chart that he's got up in. Let me get it there. Where basically just summarizes the percentages of families and stuff up in the corner. A table, the percentage of vertebrate diversity whose origins are explicable over the time scale. So riffing off this paper and no other data field, he decides that 98.4% of the species on Earth have originated in only 12,000 years or less, which is not something you can conclude.
Makes sense to me.
Technical paper. So this is a pure shell game going on. Like this is a new thing for him to be doing. He supposedly is going to, he deliberately avoids, in a little footnote, he says, I'm not including any of the fossils. I'm going to discuss that in later chapters. Well, we'll see how close he gets to all of that in relation to the later chapters. Yeah, because from what I gather from other people that have criticized it, yeah, he's not really going to be doing anything on that. And the greatest show on earth thing,
Well,
that's
more
another
of a genetics guy anyway.
That's another Bermuda Triangle defense, because that book covered a lot of evolutionary stuff. And that means by citing it, it means Jeanson must theoretically be aware of its content. So we'll find out whether or not he veers into subject matter where, excuse me, but you cited Dawkins' book. And so you must theoretically be aware of all of this stuff. Anyway, earlier today, I happened to spot an email from our dear pal Otangelo, who has been going in a joust with Demeter, the Origin of Life guy, over Origin of Life stuff. And it's been a ping pong match, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and I've been kind of staying out of it. But this one piqued my curiosity because he was actually kind of discussing a particular isolated point, and this one just popped up out of the blue. I may be going into more detail on it in a future evolution hour, we'll see, but it's definitely going to be referenced in Rocks 2 because it bumps into some specific matters of protein folding and other kinds of stuff that relates. And there's a book that just came out a couple of years ago from Marcos Eberlin of the Discovery Institute, Foresight, how the chemistry of life reveals planning and purpose, which is Otangelo was apparently just burbling over this. He really wanted us to see it. And it's got stuff in there about the little insect that's got the gears in quotes, and stuff on the carnivorous plants, which we're going to be alluding to in relation to Brandon's tool and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, all I did was ask Otangelo regarding what turned out to only be 3 papers, one of which he cited 3 times with completely different links each time.
He tripled it.
3 separate papers. But they're all, it was all the same paper. This work by Drummond and Wilkie on mistranslation of folding. Anyway, I asked him whether or not he had done any follow-up work on what the other papers that they had done, other work, and had he contacted any of these authors to find out whether they agreed with his spin on their own work. And his reply
I'm going to guess the answer.
His reply to me was, which papers and what is your precise inquiry? Which is Otangeloese for no, he hadn't done any follow-up, and no, he didn't contact any of the authors involved. Otherwise, he would have just said so. So we'll find out what he does after that. It turns out that a few of the authors, this Alan Drummond, I had some of his stuff in the bibliography already. some other material from Jean-Francois Gou. I had several of his papers. And so they've got a larger field. It's all about this particular protein synthesis error checking system that Angelo immediately jumps off the gangplank and argues, it can't possibly be anything other than intelligently designed because it won't work without it. And Demeter is trying to say, but there's no indication that this had to have been there to begin with, if this is a derived evolved trait. The problem is on this one paper, the Drummond and Wilkie one from 2008, is they're explicitly talking about beneficial synthesis errors that the organism is able to make use of beneficially, and the evolutionary dynamics of it all. And I asked him that, did you fairly represent that in your treatment of it, as you authority quoted it in your booklet? And of course he hadn't done that. So anyway, Atangelo was being Atangelo. What can I say? Part two, I'll get to it. It's a funky one because we'll be veering perilously close to religion topics, although the focus I'm going to be dealing with actually isn't about religion, it's about something after. It's from Apologia video. But let me immediately jump in to make sure we thank our patrons for the program that have helped enormously. And the stimulus check arrived today in the bank account, so I will be able to get the damn car servicing done, which I've been waiting for quite some time. It's having this little engine service needed. Yes. Anyway, our colleagues Hendrel, Colton, Eric Rowley, Suris, and Zeshi, our researchers Travis Adams, Ian Chen, who is in the chat, Convert Me, Stephen Early, who is in the chat, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Pelagia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, our assistant researchers, Doranku, Totus Rial, Christopher Johnson, Brent Neville, Daniel, Steve Bauman, geologist, fun. Merrick Beddoes, Insects Are Cool, Devin Breeze, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalopicus, Bo Rasmussen, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and our legacy patrons who I will rattle off at great speed, even though it's been a long time, but nonetheless they helped at one point or another, and I will always thank you. Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nanya, Staggle, Sunsky Stone, Ugly German Truth, Everett, and Sewer. You've all made the difference between squeaking along and more comfortable squeaking along from one day to the next. So, what is your take upon the idea that you can extrapolate from animal domestication over the last 12,000 years to the presumption that 98% of extant species could have originated over the last 12,000 years?
Well, even if that, it doesn't really help his argument. It doesn't really help his argument, because his argument is that this was occurring in like 4,000 years. So even if true, so
this is the matter of not merely hide the ball, but bring the ball on and trim it into smaller and smaller parts, in hoping that you can work it down to a little teeny tennis ball that you can sneak on to a field to which you have put a moving goalpost, and which you discover that you're not actually there anybody else, because everybody else in the science community is playing on a completely different field with a much bigger ball.
RJ, do you remember the so when we did the Apologia video last time, and one of the arguments that Eric Hovind put forth was the oldest seafloor is late Jurassic in age. Well, okay, but that's still 160 million years older than you think the Earth is.
Yeah.
So.
And I think the number, and this will be alluding to it in rocks too. I have been going through the culling of the vast array of technical literature that's been in nodes of stacks of paper and that, and most of it, all that huge amount of material on the creation science topic, is funneling over relevant to stocks too. But anyway, something that roughly 55% of the various seafloor has already been subducted. So what you end up with are little fragments of stuff. And there's even that little bit we alluded to in Rocks 1 of a little tiny snippet of Carboniferous stuff that's left over in the Eastern Mediterranean, a little teeny blip left over. But by and large, no, it all disappears on that. And so we'll be discussing a lot about plate tectonics and about the dynamics of stuff. I don't think we mentioned the cold slab thing in volume 1, so it's going to be in volume 2. And this is a general point for everybody in the live chat on there, especially all the ones on Twitter. If for those who have been reading Rocks 1, or if there's any topics in there that you go, dang, they didn't mention this, shoot us a note, and we'll see what we can do on incorporating it into it. We'll be discussing a lot of little cute little chestnuts along the way, including the Lost Squadron that just popped up in one of the most recent debates and all of that. It turns out, buried in my notes, I had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 independent blobs of Lost Squadron stuff from the internet that I had encountered when people have been throwing this argument at me over the last 10 years, and I would research it, and then it's in the stack, and I would hit again, and I would research it, and hit newer. So it's got a whole bunch of stuff in there. Kent Hovind would repeat it. I remember him doing it on video. I think that was the first time I actually delved into it in detail. But it keeps on popping up like a little bad penny in creationist worldview, especially from people that watch older videos. They don't realize that, nah. So anyway, I've consolidated all of those little packets. There will be quite a nice second extensive bit on Kent Hovind in the cosmological field and the wackiness that he pops up in there. Also, there'll probably be an info box on Joe Baker, who I'm sure you have never heard of, Jackson. Joe Baker, who's still around, I think he was up until COVID selling kites and crap down in Florida or Louisiana or somewhere, down in your neck of the woods in the South. But anyway, he was and remains an absolute Hovindista. I bumped into him about 2001 or so because he was being extolled by Philip Jeanson and the intelligent design community about this plucky student, Joe Baker, who was taking on the Darwinian assumptions in their science classes. Not one of the people, Johnson, Wells, Behe, who were all falling over this kid, ever thought to ask him, how old do you think the Earth is? Where are you getting your sources from? Oh, Kent Hovind, which is exactly what the case was. But anyway, I contacted the little corp, and like Kent Hovind, we had a little telephone conversation and so forth. So I have quite a lot of material on the interesting world of Joe Baker, who is like a teenage version at the time, a teenage version of SFT, standing for truth, in that he just sucked up parasitically all of this material and repeated it back with strident confidence and all that. So anyway, he's going to get in there in a cute little other videos. Oh, Slade asked, what is the Lost Squadron? Ah, you dare ask. During World War II, I can't remember, I think it was a B-24 or B-17, I'm not sure which. But anyway, it crashed in Greenland, and I think everybody on board perished. For years, they tried to locate the plane, which it turns out by the time they encountered it in the early 21st century, it had become buried in a pile of snow, so that it was now way down in the ice, like 40 or 50 feet, and they had to drill down and do seismic things to find it. And NOLA, I think, did a special on it, how they managed to find the thing. Well, the creationists say, aha, look at all that snow that appeared in just the time since that plane crashed in the 1940s. That means that all these ice core things don't represent millions and thousands of years. They're just, and the climatologists would say, wait a minute, the snow that gets compacted is different in character than the snow that comes down right at the edge. And so, and the snow rate up on the tops of the hills are different than the stuff down below. In other words, they can tell the difference in this stuff. There's little gas things trapped and all this kind of stuff. Water crystals are different, you know. And anybody that knows about this, Phil Plait weighed in on it. He was saying about what an idiot these people were. That's all part of those little packets that I accumulated over time. So although it's been mentioned by AID and ICR and both Pro and Con and Creation Wiki and Phil Plait and and Ted Hogan, so there was a whole bunch of stuff knocking around in there. And I think what would be fun is that so much of this stuff isn't available currently on the internet, or you wouldn't immediately know that it was on the internet. I got to track down whether or not even some of the old web pages are still active or not, whether they've been moved around and that. But anyway, I think it'll probably be the most comprehensive and up-to-date discussion of the damn Lost Squadron issue than anybody has managed to do. Research is such effing fun. I really enjoy it.
Pretty
It's
interesting
in many ways, but you put stuff together, and there's so many little fiddly bits of things that, of course, there's going to be a section on the bombardier beetle that will be a review of the various people that have shot their mouth off on it over the years, plus a discussion of what the actual technical material is. This is relating to your flame-throwing Parasaurolophus that was in the Dwayne Gish Kids book. Erica does she's read that book as well. And wow, this is stuff that's it would be too hilariously stupid to have made up, that you couldn't make up anything quite wackier than that kind of stuff. Yeah, the Slade Up says the heat of the plane made it sink lower. Well, I would have done a bit, but the main thing is basically it was the amount of snow that happens after the attack, and it gradually is being. Remember, it's on a glacier, so it's moving too. So you have this moving object that's gradually going, and it's getting dived down and scrunched and farther down the road and all that. We know some processes can happen rapidly. Another one that I had some notes on back in the day, and I'd alluded to, but I'd forgotten where the main material is. Now I found the cross references on it. Was an 1860s era, I think, ship that had run aground, steamer on the Mississippi River, and people had been hunting for the wreck for years, and they finally found the bloody thing underneath a guy's field, way away from where the river is now, under like about 40 feet of ground, because that's how fast the Mississippi sedimentation comes down. So the idea that natural processes couldn't bury trees and dead cows and other kinds of stuff in a relatively rapid way in non-flood circumstances, let alone flash floods and all those kinds of things, landslides and other stuff. You're actually going to get the time of day to IC, irreducible complexity. We alluded to some of that, I think, in book one. Let me find out. Let me look over here. We have a little index item for that. Because irreducible complexity. We mentioned it kind of in passing because that's mainly an intelligent design mantra that our major target was Answers in Genesis. And so we're dealing with Unger's creationists. It's not as though they don't allude to irreducible complexity along the way, but it's not a gigantic component of their argument. And part of the reason is just perf wars. The last thing that Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham want to do is to point neon lights over to the Discovery Institute and Michael Behe and all these non-young Earth creationists. No. They don't want to do that. So they're very, very careful about how they word it. Anyway, now part two relates to last December. Apologia did a YouTube piece on a creationist that I wasn't terribly closely aware of. I had a little bit in my bibliography, and that was David C. Pack, who is apparently the current head of the wacky old Worldwide Church of God that Garner Ted Armstrong used to run. Tell me what you know about it.
A whole...
Not getting sound.
Arnrod did a whole series.
Yeah, I think you're dropping out.
Can you hear me?
Occasionally.
RJ?
Yeah. You were
Oh,
dropping
okay.
out there for just a minute. It's the internet. You know, Louisiana is covered with the dark cloud of doom.
Yeah. R and Rod did a whole series of videos about Pack a few years back, rebutting his long series about proving that evolution is false and all that.
Yeah, I had only dealt with him, and there's a stupid Windows feature update that popped right up and wants to restart. Oh, yeah. So hold on just a moment while I pick a time for it to do that, so that it will not interrupt my bloody show. Idiotic. Yikes. Yeah. Let's see. Want to do for today. Yikes. Yeah, I guess I can let it just go with that. Okay. Anyway, the piece. So I was looking that up because what was interesting is along the way, a bunch of stuff was being alluded to where I was going, ow, this is like a march down memory lane. So he starts off with a 2014 article on anthropics by Eric Metaxas, which that one is available in a public link, so I'll be putting that in too in a bit. And going to that, that was a whole secondary siphon, because later on Pack started playing the second law of thermodynamics card. Where's Sal Cordova when you need him? I was thinking, because he was how flimsy that argument is, and here he is tossing it up in the modern times. And Pack put up a slide, quote, and the principle of evolution, each is precisely the converse of the other, as Aldous Huxley defined it, citing Henry Morris on this matter from The Twilight of Evolution. No page number, but fortunately, little old RJ happened to have a hard copy of the book in his library, so I tracked it down. It was actually on page 35. So here it is that you've got this Garner Ted Armstrong guy, a clone, Pack, who is riffing off of a quote from Henry Morris from the 1960s, as if it bears on the subject in the 21st century. It was bad for 1963. It's even worse. The actual quote turned out to relate not to Aldous Huxley, as Morris claimed, but to Julian Huxley, his older brother. Aldous never came up at all in this. So Pack already didn't understand the text. He was misattributing it to the wrong Huxley, even though Henry Morris hadn't got it wrong. So he doesn't even read Henry Morris attentively. And the part that Pack nicked didn't have any sources whatsoever. So here is Morris saying, it would hardly be possible to conceive of two more completely opposite principles than this principle of entropy increase and the principle of evolution. Each is precisely the converse of the other. As Huxley defined it, evolution involves a continual increase of order, of organization, of size, of complexity. The entropy principle involves a continual decrease of order, of organization, of size, of complexity. It seems axiomatic that both cannot possibly be true, but there is no question whatever that the second law of thermodynamics is true. So it wasn't even Jackson is trying to restart, and yes, there he goes. Whee! And as soon as you hit on the thing, there you are, back again. So what it was, that the guy was riffing off not of Huxley originally, but purely on Henry Morris's spin of Huxley, and then getting the rained off. Then Pack nicks the good old Derek Ager. It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have
that
been debunked.
Quote
Pops up.
I looked for that quote for like 20 minutes and I found it.
Yeah. And I found it finally as well. This was from a 1976 article from the Nature of the Fossil Record, and I must say, Back in the day, if I tried to track this down in the 1970s or 80s or 90s, you couldn't have located it. It was just impossible. So the fact that we can do that now is so much nicer. The quote, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student, from Truman's Austria of Griffia to Carruthers's Zephyrinthus de Lunii, have now been debunked in quotation marks. Similarly, my own experience of more than 20 years looking for evolutionary lineages among the Mesozoic Brachiopoda has proved them equally elusive." And that's as far as it went. He was just talking about specific taxa within a very narrow field, and he put debunked in quotation marks that show that, yeah, it's not quite as much as he was going, and whether or not he would have had that opinion, or that anybody studying brachiopods in the 21st century should have that opinion based upon Ager's secondary authority view in a generic article in Science magazine. No, this is absolutely weird. Another thing, I pointed it out to Apologia at the time, because ironically, when he put up a picture of Ager, it wasn't a picture of Ager, it was a picture of Immanuel Velikovsky, because I recognized it instantly. I don't know where because Ager gets connected to the Velikovsky worldview. For those of you who are unaware with Immanuel Velikovsky, he was a crackpot from the 1950s, who I was a little Velikovskyan for a little brief period in the 1970s, and back when my method was very bad. And so Ager got authority quoted a lot in the Velikovsky worldview, and that's how I think that there were quotations about Ager show up on a Velikovsky website, and there's a little picture of Velikovsky, and that's how Apologia managed to glom onto the little thing. And Pack also invoked the irreducible complex mousetrap, presumably unaware of its demolition by then at the Dover trial at Kitzmiller, and so that it was like a dead letter. So this is a beautiful example of how error continues to metastasize through the anti-evolution worldview from people who just don't fact check their sources, that they glom onto really old books. Stephen Early, Velikovsky fan when I was a teen. Oh, Stephen, yeah, that would be a delightful thing to have on if you ever wanted to do a video here. You don't even need to put your face up. You could have if you have a camera where you can do it, just turn the camera off. But I think it'd be a fascinating thing to discuss, because it was an enticing thing. It came out at the time I hit it, when de Grazia and others were kind of in the mini Velikovsky revival. I actually worked for Ponce magazine down in Portland that was a hotbed of Velikovskians, and met Velikovsky when he was at the AAS meeting and all that. So I have several of his books signed by the great man himself. And it was something that seemed remarkably enticing until you started to look at the source data. And poor Jackson is frozen, so I'm not sure whether or not his connection is disintegrated again. I'll turn him off for the moment until we start seeing motion again, and I think he'll probably have to restart. The internet connection down there, I think, is running on steam power or something. I'm not sure what the difficulty is. The history revisions. Oh yes, the whole Ages in Chaos. I'll put that up as a little blurb on there. Ages in Chaos was Velikovsky's attempt to revamp the entire Egyptian chronology, and he spent a bunch of books on it, multiple volumes on it. That was basically the super project of the rest of his life. He lived all the way down, I think, into the 1990s or so. He was a ways down there. But it also connects up with discussions of the Exodus, and because the same thing that an awful lot of creationists do, trying to figure out when the Exodus was taking place, are relying on some of the same data field that Velikovsky was dealing with. And the little guy, I've forgotten his name, Ronan or something or other, who's trying to revamp Egyptian chronology unsuccessfully as well, is basically recapitulating the same problem that Velikovsky was into, that if you just start moving things around and removing pharaohs and thinking they're duplications and stuff, there's a whole bunch of interconnected stuff that gets you into a mess. And you have to give Velikovsky kudos for effort, but it never got anywhere and never really resolved much of anything. But anyway, there was an Ippaware papyrus. I would type that into the papyrus. This thing shows up in a lot of different contexts. As I said, it's not related to the Exodus, but gets dragged in. Ippaware was a little functionary in the end, I think, of the Middle Kingdom that was writing about terrible things that had befallen the kingdom. And it apparently relates to drought stuff, which may or may not be related to the Santorini eruption. That's a side issue. But it was enough reminiscent of the plagues of Egypt to sound maybe. So Velikovsky and others would link this thing up. And in Velikovsky's case, he was following traditional views, which put the Exodus at 1500 BC. And so he's ramming everything into that time frame. Modern apologists are trying to ram it down into the New Kingdom. And so trying to pull the Ippaware papyrus all the way down. Oh, good. We've got apparently a little note from Restream noting all that as a cue. Oh, no, that's my message. You can Google that. And you can find out an awful lot about the side issues on it. I think we'll be alluding to it a little bit in Rocks 2, but it'll come up in greater context in relation to religion discussions and the origin of the Exodus thing and trying to figure out who the hell the Pharaoh of Exodus was. And spoiler alert, I haven't figured this one out. So it's a real mess. Lisa for Truth says, can't they use something from this century? Oh, were that but true. Now, the apologetics is actually quite recent. That Velikovsky, of course, is doing stuff in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Roll, maybe his name is Roll. Stephen Early, an archaeology professor over Ippaware. I would imagine so. Yeah. It's I got oddball looks from my history professors and stuff because I was in college at the time. When I was in my little Velikovsky phase. And if I were to go in a time machine and meet my 1972 self, oh boy, would I have a lot to talk about how things had changed. But it was an important learning exercise because it was the seed corn of figuring out why I had gotten so wrong on things. And that I was relying secondarily on figures that I was not really fact checking. And I was cherry picking for authority quotes mode. And it was when I started looking beyond just the little authority quote blip, but looking at the data field that was being discussed in the whole paper, that Velikovsky started falling apart. And I allude to it a little bit in, I can't remember whether it was in the Dynamania chapter or one of the others in the old tip. You'll find it knocking around. Remember my little website? Download those PDFs. There's an awful lot of stuff in there. I covered a lot and alluded to what was going on it. Richard Milton, who, whither for the grace of Providence might have gone I, never did develop sound method. He was about the same age I am. And he swallowed Velikovsky hook, line, and sinker and kept repeating stuff on him all the way into the 1990s. And I think he even alludes to him occasionally since then. So that if you have a bad method and you never correct yourself, you get into a terrible mess. For me, the thing that was the deal breaker for Velikovsky didn't have anything to do with Ippaware. Here's a cute little thing about plate tectonics, because there's a book, one of Velikovsky's books, let me type that in there, Earth in Upheaval. Earth in Upheaval from 1955. This was actually the one where Velikovsky really tried to dive into geology much. Worlds in Collision was all about legends and the like. That he, a psychologist, psychoanalyst, he was a Freudian, which is another problem with him. Anyway, Earth in Upheaval was just a retread of a mass of catastrophist thinking, including George Macready Price. That was one of the things that was like a little warning bell that he was taking Macready Price seriously when he shouldn't have. But one of the little bits Stephen Early, read it, don't remember it. I don't blame you. It's not a very big book either. It's, I think, smaller than Worlds in Collision was. But anyway, one of the little blips in there that it impressed me enormously at the time, and ultimately was the undoing of Velikovsky, had to do with the Ice Age in India. Because in the old pre-plate tectonic age, and remember he's writing this in 1955, that you have India parked down there in Asia, and there was an ice age in India, and it starts at the southern tip and goes northward. And you're going, what? How could an ice age go from equatorial India northward? That isn't how glaciers are supposed to work, is it? And so that was a real puzzle until right at the time that I'm getting knee deep into it in the 1970s, plate tectonics is starting to hit the fan. And so by the mid 1970s, it was quite clear that when India had its ice age back in the Silurian, it wasn't in the northern hemisphere. It was parked down at the South Pole next to Australia and Antarctica and South America and all the rest. And so the ice age that occurred in that whole region started at the South Pole and moved northwards up the tip of what would eventually become India. So something that was seemingly catastrophic and inexplicable, an ice age in hot India, made complete sense because back when that occurred, it wasn't where it is now. And worse, we can track the path of India from its old position in the South Pole to where it is now, slammed into the Asian plate and ramming up the Himalayas because of not one but two volcanic things, which we'll be alluding to in more detail. We mentioned the Deccan Traps in conjunction with the Katy extinction and all of that. That's on the west part of India. And it's a huge magmatic province, not quite as big as the Siberian Traps, and I think it's bigger than the Columbia basalt that I live on here in the Pacific Northwest. But it turns out that, one, that Deccan Traps is very specifically formed from the Reunion Island hotspot down in the Indian Ocean. And that hotspot has stayed put, as hotspots tend to do. One of the things that has been the case of recent discoveries in geology is the hotspots are kind of blobs of heat that don't go anywhere in the deep mantle. They're there. And it's the land moving over them that's moving, not them. So the one under Yellowstone is parked in one spot. The one under the Hawaiian Islands is parked in one spot. The one Seychelles Islands, the Reunion Island hotspot, is all one. And it produces very distinctive chemical signatures. So what we got is the Deccan Traps has the same volcanic signature as the rocks they've pulled up from the Reunion Island hotspot down in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So in other words, it's as India passed over that hotspot, it got the Deccan Traps, and then it kept moving because of other reasons, but the plates move, and tore it away. And so one half is down in the Indian Ocean, and the other half is on the western part of India. But it gets even better. And I only really discovered this little blip in just the last 5 years, is there's another older volcanic deposit in India on the east side of India. And it's about, I think, 90 million years before that, somewhere around in there. And it has another signature bit. And it relates to a volcanic magma province down in present-day New Zealand. So what we're looking at is the timing of when India was squeezed out like a banana through a peel, kind of like what happens to chunks of California as it's being wedged along fault lines along San Andreas and that, and big chunks of California are moving northward. In fact, the Baja BC argument suggests that those processes have done this even earlier, and there's chunks of stuff now up in British Columbia that were originally down in Mexico. And so this is like a conveyor belt thing that happens when these big plates in the North American plates colliding with stuff and squishing stuff up northwards. But anyway, same thing is happening then with India. After long after the Silurian Ice Age. It's normally, India is moving northward, but in one direction, and it slams into this now New Zealand plate, and there used to be a continental mass and big plateaus. There used to be a bunch of stuff is now all eroded away, and there's just traces of it that they managed to dig up. And basically had its big volcanic deposit there on the east side of India, and that deflected it, and now it then headed northward and continued on that trajectory across the Reunion Islands hotspot, and eventually shrinking the Tethya Sea and slamming into whatever. Lisa says, I still laugh when I think of kangaroos being blown to Australia by a volcanic explosion. Yes, yeah. That's the one that's so stupid that nobody should have ever thought of it. And it was one of the gang at Creation Wiki, I think. And there was discussions on it, which I believe have not been taken down. We had the access to it and alluded to it in Rocks 1, but since then, I guess enough of a flap, they've apparently obliterated it. So all that paper trail that you would get electronically for it has just been snuffled on the thing. But the gist was that somebody thought that maybe koalas and kangaroos and others were catapulted in the volcanic eruptions after the ark landed and flew that way down to Australia. And apparently very selectively, because they managed to just pick up a bunch of marsupials, but not one damn placental mammal. Isn't that extraordinary? Let alone therapsids or any of the other critters that would have been coming off of the ark, that must have been on the ark and that somehow went extinct. Which brings us around the corner and through the woods. Back to that bit about the Jeanson and his rapid speciation thing. Is that you just can't start talking about all these food crops that were domesticated and not wonder why is it that we've got paleontological and regional variations to where it's potatoes in Peru, not in India, and it's rice in Asia, not in Duluth, and we've got chocolate in one hemisphere and not in the other, tomatoes and wheat crops, and all these things are specialized to various regions because they've evolved over a very long period of time. And eventually cold hardy versions of wheat are the ones that got domesticated by people in the Fertile Crescent. And there's a whole paleogeography of why they are where they are, which creationists need to explain. So all these human beings coming off of the ark, the little kids off of Noah and the kids, some of whom in the process of breeding like flies or rabbits, fast enough to produce the Egyptian pyramids all after the flood, and mammoths are evolving from the elephant kind aboard the ark and then going extinct all after the ark. We're all talking the last 4,500 years here. And all those human beings, as the population is rising rapidly enough, changing dynamically, how can you do it that fast? Moving to the Americas, and they are taking all of these food crops with them, and alpacas and llamas and all of that unknown in the old world, and it just piles up absurdity on absurdity on absurdity as to why the various regional areas have such distinctive flora and fauna and crops to domesticate in the first place. Titan says, wait a couple of 100,000 years and someone will be wondering how the heck bananas got everywhere. Well, you know what Ray Comfort says, that banana is designed to fit your hand and in your mouth. I mean, there it is. Never mind that that's a process of artificial selection, which brings us back to the whole notion. I think my favorite example of how plants have differentiated by artificial selection has to do with broccoli and cauliflower and all of that bunch. There's a whole slew of things that have all come about from just artificial selection, that they're all part of a relatively narrow family of plants that look very different from one another now. Lisa says, some also use population to support a young Earth. Yeah, that one is one of the mantras of Henry Morris. He was pushing that out in the 1970s, that There's no problem to explain billions of feet a day, because if you start out with 8 people and they grow exponentially, you have tons of people available, easy peasy. Never mind that there's no indication that populations can ever do that naturally, and that you've got constraints about diseases and the things that was the point, is you had a mortality rate that remained relatively constant, that populations could never grow terribly large until medicine came along to lower the death rate, lower infant mortality. That's the thing that produced the demographic bulge of the big population growth in the 20th and our present century. It had nothing to do with changing the hardware of our bodies. Without that medicine, you don't have rapid growth rates. The other problem is no matter how fast the growth rate is, initially there's very few people, and they're all incestuous as all get out. That everybody's marrying their sister and their cousin and their aunt and all that, and they have to be, women have to be pumping babies out as fast as they can, and for decades and centuries in some cases. You know, that what was Mrs. Noah still giving birth to children at age 600? What exactly were they doing? They're very vague about this, but the problem is that whatever rate you come up with initially, the population is going to be so low that you can't account for how you can get people to the Americas and in Africa and the farthest regions of Asia and Europe, for that matter, and Australia and all the rest, with all the distinctive characteristics in animals and plants and haplotypes and all that we can observe they do. And needless to say, nobody in this area, not Nathaniel Jeanson, not Carter, although they do papers and juggle the numbers around, it's a shell game. And we're going to be alluding to that as well in Rocks 2, because it's that what happened during the flood. You know, it's not just killing off dinosaurs and therapsids and giant dragonflies now, is it? It's got to be doing stuff, and you have to figure out how the demographics of human beings are connected up together. Lisa for truth. Mr. Broccoli, yes, as Kent Hovind weighed in on that. I think I did a discussion of that in one of the previous episodes. It's been a couple years since I've done a full-blown Kent Hovind show. Gosh, if there's anybody that is monumentally credulous and will repeat almost anything, provided it's not really true, but he thinks it is, and that it's almost a miracle in the drinking game that Dapper Dino has, and that when they go through Kent Hovind videos with Ben Hovind, they do once in a while have to take a drink for something that Kent inadvertently says that's actually accurate. But boy, it's few and far between. They drink much more because of Mothra coming in and screeching than they do from, and Kent Hovind with his lame jokes, often which land lamely. That's the way he is. Titan says, Ray has only ever seen bananas at Piggly Wiggly. Yes, and I'm sure Piggly Wiggly has only seen Ray in a context where they would rather not. So Stephen Early says, remember, they were all at Babel speaking one language. Yeah, that's another side issue, which we'll be discussing, is the origins of language and language distribution. And all of the Babelists kind of tunnel vision in on the Indo-European language system, which is the one that the Semite language comes from, the Hebrew. They don't bother about everybody else. And there is a demographics and time frame involved, just how long languages take to develop and how deep roots go back even farther and farther just for little teeny fragments that's happening. One thing that, I guess, Lisa for truth, drink, oh, wrong show. There's no offense. No offense will be taken if you want to swig it too while we discuss the stupid here. Looks like Jackson's internet was not able to get in, but I'm glad he was able to come in for the material that we did put in. We've got our basic issues coming all on the field. Any questions for moi as we wind down towards the tail end of the show? Fire them away in there, and I will attempt to answer them the best that I can. And remember, again, everybody reading Rocks were there. If there are any topics in there that were not discussed or discussed insufficiently, but mainly the ones where, ooh, that's a topic that pops up. We want to make Rocks 2 nicely topical, in picking up slack on a lot of the stuff that's been making the rounds on various creationist apologetics, because they're basically self-identifying what they think are hot button issues. The issues of Acts and Facts and the postings at creation.com and all that are automatically flagging the stuff that they think are the cute apologetics. Most of the time, it's just repetition of previous arguments like mantras. You get constant arguments in articles in there repeating the mantras that there's a problem with the Big Bang and that there are no transitional fossils and that chimpanzees are not related to us. So there, that one's guaranteed to be by Jeffrey Tompkins. And it just cycles around and around and around. We'll be interpolating all that material in as well. Oh, Lisa for Truth. Why do Protestants use a Catholic timeline? Well, because they're lazy. Although technically speaking, the revised calendar, the Gregorian calendar, they were slow to adopt it. And of course, the Russian Orthodox technically never adopted it. So that's why January is when Christmas occurs, because they're still stuck on it. There was a reluctance to adopt the Gregorian calendar in the Protestant world. And that's why when George Washington was born, he was born, I think, on February 11th or somewhere around in there. The date is the different than the one that we celebrated now, because after he was born, I think in the 1740s or 50s, somewhere around in there, Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar because they were just getting out of phase with everybody. In the same way that once railroads started adopting standardized time zones, everybody just has to play along and you can't get away from it because you have to know when you're going to start your radio program and when the train's going to show up and what time you're planning on meeting. So it standardizes things that way. The Gregorian calendar, of course, was instituted because the days had fallen out of alignment, because the old Julian calendar that was done by Julius Caesar back in Roman times, that was itself a reform to make the calendar match up better. If it's not really accurate, it's falling out of tune with the seasons. And if it keeps up long enough, you're going to have winter in the middle of spring. Because it's all out of sync. And so you have to add stuff in. And it involves adding or not days, leap years. That's where we get leap days and stuff from. Leap years in anything. It roughly coincides with election years. Leap years are the same time as election years, every 4 years, unless they're in a century, in which case it's not a leap year. Unless the century is divisible by 400, in which case there is a leap year. See how simple that is? And even at that 365.2422 or whatever it is just enough that you have to sync it up, and eventually it'll slightly fall out of alignment again anyway. So Stephen Early says January 7, Christmas, January 8 after 2100. Oh, Lisa says, I'm talking about Usher. Yeah, Usher is somebody that in part gets a bit of a bad rap because he's the cliche, the Earth on 4004 BC. But based on what it was like to be a scholar in the 17th century, he was actually pretty careful. And he was trying to do something which was silly, which was simply adding up the patriarch thing. He was diligent about it to try to figure out when the creation was, because the Bible doesn't tell you. Boy, that would simplify things enormously if it had just been more specific. They had to interpolate it. And as is known, depending upon what figures you use and how you add them up, you can arrive at a wiggle room for when the creation was supposed to be. And that 4004 date was Usher's. But the dates slide all over the place by centuries. And so you can find some creationists that are can't figure out quite when the flood is. And so some will have it 2350 BC, some will have 100 or 1,000 years earlier, and things get into a terrible mess. And I'm aware also of the difficulty of dating the Exodus, which we mentioned earlier, the 1500 BC date, which is the traditional one that old Velikovsky was using. And you still find, if you find any creationist talking about an Exodus of 1500 BC, they're a hyper-conservative. They're drawing on really old apologetics. Boomer used his Mayan calendar was started 3300 BC by the Olmecs, and his more precise Chinese calendar is older. It was a commerce and trade requirement, so billing was on time and in year. Well, it's not merely commerce and trade. There's an awful lot of religion to it. I mean, for the Mesoamerican cultures, the planets were rather bloodthirsty gods, and you needed to watch out what was going on. And they built up a whole cosmology about these ends, because the various movements of Venus and other planets sync up, and they'll restart the same cycle after like 52 years because of just the eccentricities of the way the orbits work. And they detected that fairly early in their meticulous observations. So that's where they got into these 52-year cycles, and their calendar was built on it, where shit hits fan, and then the grand cycles over long periods of time. That's why you were coming up with the idea that there would be a 2012 catastrophe and all this thing, these world ages turnover. And an awful lot of that really wasn't mine. It was stuff that was accreted by people who overblew the Mayans. Fortunately, we have much more knowledge now about what they actually wrote because we can read the Mayan language that we couldn't before. That enormous amount of epigraphy and things that have been done in ferreting out. For one thing, it kind of dawned on them that aren't there living Mayans? Can't we ask them what their language is? And when they started connecting actual Mayan speakers up with hieroglyphs and stuff, and figured out how what connects up with what, the things made sense because they're writing it in the Mayan language, and so the grammar and structure, the way things are put up, help illuminate what words mean, even when they didn't know quite what it was. The only ones for years, back when I was growing up, the only thing you knew about the Mayan calendar was the dates. That it worked out. So you could date a stela to January 3rd, 823 AD, very specifically. You wouldn't know what the hell had happened there because you couldn't read any of the rest of it. Now we can read the rest of it. So the Mayan historiography is at a much higher level, and anybody that tries to wade into that from creationist perspective, or ancient astronauts, or Sitchins and all the others, little whack-a-lone balloons, just steer clear of them. Titan, it says, I hope the world doesn't end again. I'm getting too old for another one. Yeah, don't you just hate it when the world keeps ending over and over again? Yeah, it ends one day, and then you got to go through and you buy your end of the world cards again and have to set up another party when it ends a week later. I know it's just a real big pain, but you got to do it because otherwise the end of the world card makers aren't going to be in business. We don't want to let that happen. They'll go the way of the buggy whips people. Bring back more shit on the streets. Anyway, America's indigenous never made a wheel. What's up with that? Well, they knew about the concept of wheel. There are wheel toys that exist in the Mesoamerican culture. But the problem is they didn't have any pack animals. You try to use a llama to pull a cart. No, it doesn't like doing that. And there are no large oxen, no horses, even though the horse had originated in the New World but died out millions of years earlier. So all the animals that got domesticated for those kinds of purposes didn't exist in the New World. So there's nothing to pull stuff. And although you can get by with human-pulled carts in certain cultures that are authoritarian and have a lot of poverty where you might as well do something on it, apparently that wasn't quite the way on here. And also I would argue that in the case of the Maya, they have much more concerns chopping the trees down to make sure their cities weren't being overgrown and their fields weren't being overgrown by the constantly relentless jungle. That really preoccupied their attention. So I think there was a lot of stuff that was going on to where, with the absence of animals that were going to be suitable for pulling carts, there was no reason to work on it. And even at that, wheel vehicles underwent a very slow development as people improved them over time and figured out how to make ones out of wood with lighter weights. And you find that with the technology of chariots and that, which of course didn't occur until after the domestication of the horse. The horse was actually deployed to pull carriages before people started riding them on their own. We know the thing could adapt quickly because the horses that were let loose by the conquistadors and got loose in the 15th century, 16th century, the Plains Indians adapted to them with blinding speed. and made it horses an absolutely integral part of their culture, which is an interesting bit about how quickly cultural things can change, even in what is supposedly a traditionalist, patriarchal or matriarchal society that doesn't want to change much, and yet adapted with astonishing speed to the presence of that, in addition to various food crops and other things that popped in. So there we go. Well, we're past the hour. Jackson is apparently not returning. We've covered everything. Anybody got any last minute questions before we shove off here? In states where they're loosening mask routines and wanting to go back and do things normal, don't listen to them. Continue to wear a mask, use social distancing and prudence, get the vaccine and all the rest, and work to keep the virus contained. And you'll need to do that to compensate for all the stupid people. So Lisa put a little post up in there. I think that's just about everything we need to deal with. We'll catch you all next week. There'll be more Evolution Hour. We'll keep you posted on everything. Boomer says horses are an invasive species, not as bad as humans, though. Humans always manage to outdo any invasive species, although bringing rabbits to Australia was not a good idea. And on that note, we will say goodbye, and we'll see you all next week. The slide says a Native American model village where there's a pull cart that has sticks that drag on the back, keeping the cart content off of the ground. Now, there was a variety of ways that people adapted the culture to deal with that. But the Mayans invented zero, but didn't have the wheel. Tenochtitlan had better environment, cleaner than anything in London, but they also ripped people's hearts out to keep the sun rising. So, trade-offs. Not entirely happy on that. Well, bye all. See you next week. Everybody stay safe.